All right, we are recording. Welcome everyone. This is Learn to Knit 2.0 with Marley Bird. My name is Jenny Bowden. I will be moderating today. I'm also joined by a colleague of mine, Caitlin Eaton. She and I will be working together to answer questions as we go along the way today. So I wanted to just quickly thank our sponsor, I Like Knitting. This is a digital magazine that is published by Prime Publishing. Prime Publishing owns favecrafts.com, allfreeknitting.com, allfreecrochet.com. Plus we publish digital magazines, one of which is I Like Knitting. And it is a digital magazine that is normally $47.64 for an entire year subscription. But we have an introductory offer for you guys today for just $11.88. That gets you access to the entire year, plus all of the back issues as well. So every pattern in the digital magazine is completely tech edited. There's no advertisements. The patterns range, all different types of patterns, different skill levels, different techniques. So it's a really great opportunity to take your skills and practice what you're learning today and make some wonderful things. So the link here at the bottom is how you can claim this deal. We're also going to post it in the chat for you guys as well, but it's a really great magazine. It's a really great deal. You can give it as gifts or just gift it to yourself. So I think that is kind of all I had right now. Like I said, we are recording today's class. So if you need to leave early or if you're, joining us not live, if you will be able to reference this recording forever. So if you have questions, if you want us to go back, we're going to we're only here for an hour today. There's only so much we can cover in 1 hour. So we're going to go as fast as we can, but at a hopefully reasonable pace. You'll have the video to reference if you have questions, if you want to practice stuff over and over again. We will interrupt as needed, but we do want to kind of keep things moving along so that we can get to everything today. So awesome. I'm going to pass it over to Marley. And like I said, please use the Q&A if you have any questions. Otherwise, have fun.
Awesome. Here we go. Hey, everybody. How are you? If you don't already know, my name is Marley Bird. I am your teacher today. I am a knitwear and crochet designer. I'm also an ambassador for Yarnspirations Yarn. I have my own yarn line. I have my own YouTube channel. I write books. I coach track, and I'm a mom to 3 kids and a wife to a very understanding husband. I love knitting and crochet. I know that many of you joined me for my knitting 101 class, which is fantastic. If you have not taken that class yet, I encourage you to do so because I will be building on skills that I taught in that class. Over there, we learned how to do the knitted cast on. We learned how to knit. We learned how to bind off in just a normal old bind off. And I talked about how to tighten up like the first stitch of your edge. I think I talked a little bit about if you dropped a stitch or like little things like that. So in this class, we're going to focus on a different cast on. So I'm going to show you a new cast on. So that way you'll have 2 cast ons in your knitter's toolbox. We're going to start off with getting our fingers a little bit nimble and start with some knitting. So that way you'll have some garter stitch. For those of you who don't remember, if you knit every row back and forth, knit every row, you get what's called garter stitch. Then we will transition from garter stitch to stockinette stitch. And that's when we will introduce the purl. That's where we will do an entire row of purls. So when you knit one entire row and then purl the next row and then knit the next row and then purl the next row, that's when you will get stockinette stitch. From there, my hope is that I can introduce to you how to incorporate knits and purls within the same row to get some ribbing. So there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to jump in. I know that there will be about the 30-minute mark. There'll be like a brief little break. So if you need a bio break or anything like that, that will be here. And as Jenny said, this is getting recorded. So if there's something that you tend to be missing or something that you want a little bit more clarification on, but I've got to move on, it's nothing against you, I promise. I just know that you'll be able to go back and watch the class and get the information you need from rewatching, so that way we can continue to move forward. Okay. All right. So first rule of all of my classes is that I want you guys to have a great positive attitude and give yourself a little bit of grace to make mistakes. This is something new. You're doing new muscle memory with your hands. So it's a little bit tricky. As you give more and more practice, it will be easier. But just like when you first picked up a crayon and tried to color, or the first time you tried to ride a bike or drive a car, it's not exactly the easiest at first. It takes some time and practice to get used to. Same thing when it comes to knitting. So be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself, and just if you practice, we will be great. Okay, I'm gonna go to my hands. Hopefully you guys will be able to see. I am just using some basic worsted weight yarn. So it's a nice smooth worsted weight yarn. And I am using, I think size 8 or 9. I think I'm using 9s. I'm using size 9 needles. Now I am using circular needles, and I think I talked about this a little bit last time. I will be using these circulars as straights. So they just happen to be joined together, right, with the cord, but I'm going to use them as if they're straight needles. Over the last several years, this has been the preferred method of a lot of different knitters. Very few knitters use straight needles anymore. So if the cable needles are throwing you off at all, if you're like, I don't have cable needles, that's okay. You can use straight needles. I just prefer cable needles, and it's easier for me to show on camera. We're going to learn what's called the cable cast on. And the cable cast on is just a slight variation of the knitted cast on that I showed you in the Knitting 101 class. So you'll go ahead and start off with a slip knot, and we're going to place that slip knot on our needle. Place that needle in your left hand. Now, the first stitch we are going to do is just like the knitted cast on, okay? So if you remember the knitted cast on, you go into the stitch from left to right, okay, from left to right. And then you'll take your yarn and you're going to wrap it around your right hand needle and come out, just like you would as you were knitting, okay? Now you extend, and you remember I said swivel and scoop up that stitch. Do not just put it on like that. If you're going like this, I don't want you to do that. I want you to swivel and scoop underneath it and place it on. All right? It's at this point that things change. I'm going to do that one more time. So I'm going to do the slip knot. I'm assuming everybody knows how to do a slip knot, so I'm not going to take extra time on that one. And then we're going to do the cast on the first one. So I'm going to go into that stitch that I just cast on, that slip knot, go around my right hand needle, just like if I were knitting, come out the stitch, extend my right hand needle just to give that stitch a little bit of extra wiggle room. And I take my left hand needle, I'm going to swivel around and scoop up. Can you guys see? I don't want to just pierce down. I want to swivel and scoop up and place it on my left hand needle. I have 2 stitches now, okay? This is where the cable cast on begins. When we did the knitted cast on, we would jump into that new stitch we just created and do that same cast on that I just did, right? With the cable cast on, I want you to place your needle between those 2 stitches. So we're not in any particular stitch. I'm literally in the space between those 2 stitches. Can you see that? I'm in the space between. I yarn over my right hand needle just like before. Come out that space just like if it was a stitch. I extend just like I did before. And I swivel and scoop. Once you get that on there, you'll do the next one. So go between the space of this new stitch and the one you did before. Go in the space between them. Yarn over your right hand needle. Come out. Extend. Swivel and scoop. Go in the space between. Around your right hand needle. Come out, extend, swivel, and scoop. Go in the space between, go around, come out, extend, swivel, and scoop. Once you get some stitches on there, what you're going to notice is you have this really pretty sort of corded look underneath the stitches if you're doing it correctly. It gives a very beautiful and stable cast on. It doesn't have a ton of stretch to it, so it's a very good, beautiful cast on for an edge of something that gives it some nice stability without overstretching at all. I really like the cable cast on for casting on in general. I also like it if I were going to cast on in the middle of a project. because I can use the cable cast on to cast on, like say I needed to add extra stitches to build a pocket. I'm sorry, give me a second. I have my phone on Do Not Disturb, but apparently it doesn't want to listen to me. All right, give me a second. Obviously, this thing, it turns back vertical on me. And I'll go just like that. Okay, I apologize, guys. It's technology, right? I have it on Do Not Disturb, so I don't know why that phone call came through. Anyways, if you were casting on to create a pocket, or maybe you needed to cast on to create sleeves on a garment, this is just a really useful way to cast on stitches, because inevitably, if we had stitches, like say we're at the end of something and we wanted to cast on more stitches, all you would do is just go between two stitches you've already created and just cast on some more. It's just a nice, beautiful cast on, all right? There are a lot of different cast-ons out there in the world, guys. So this is just another one that you now know, okay? I don't care how many stitches you have. I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I have 11. So I'm just gonna go to 10. I like the number 10, so I'm gonna go to 10 stitches. Once you get 10 stitches or however many you wanna put on there, go ahead and let's knit a couple rows to get our fingers nimble. So when you knit, you're simply gonna go into the stitch just like you normally would, and then let it jump off once you knit it. Knit. So I'm assuming everybody knows how to knit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the mechanics of knitting. One thing I do want to point out, because it's going to be relevant as we're talking through this class, is as you're knitting, you will notice that your yarn is behind your needles, right? My needles are ahead of me and my yarn is back here as I'm working with it. So I just knit that one with the yarn in my left hand. I can do it back in my right hand too. It's the exact same motion. I'm just holding the yarn in a different hand. So
Marley, real quick,
yeah.
when you can, when would you use a cable cast on versus other methods?
So it's I thought I just went over that. The cable cast on has this kind of beautiful cabled edge, so it gives a nice strong and sturdy edge. So if you're looking for something to have that type of an edge to it, you could use that. And then, as I mentioned, you could use it in the middle of a piece to add on extra stitches. It's just a good cast on to have knowledge of, and you can play around with whenever you want to try stuff out. So see here, you can see I have this sort of nice corded edge right down here with that cable cast on. Just has a really nice, pretty edge. That's it. One thing about starting with the cable cast on and then jumping right into garter stitch is it doesn't allow you to really, it doesn't really give you that garter stitch look right here at the start, because it stacks up like a knit and a knit. So you have to kind of be prepared with that, but I don't mind it because I like the way you kind of get a little rolled look there personally, but you can decide whether that's for you or not as you're working on different items. And as I mentioned, I'm just getting a couple rows here of garter stitch because I want you to have a little sampler swatch here that you have your hands on. So once you cast on, let's just knit a couple rows so that way you have some garter stitch to play around with. And as you see, as I'm knitting, I purely am just knitting. And even though I'm using a cable needle, like a needle with a cable attached, let me try that one more time. I'm using needles with the cable attaching the two. I'm still just treating them as if they are two separate needles, okay? So I hit the end of the row. I still put that needle into my left hand, put the spare needle into my right, and I just continue on. All right. I'm going to do one more row of knitting and then I'm going to jump into purls. So I want to make sure everybody's ready to go with the purls. It doesn't matter which side you're on when you're ready to do the purling. As I mentioned, I just want you to have some fabric here so you can have some different samples. Okay. Okay. So as I mentioned, here's the cable cast on. It has this nice sort of cabley ridge, like it looks like a cord to me. And then as you do garter stitch, which is knitting every row, you get these garter stitch ridges. Okay, so that's where you kind of look like you have those purl bumps, even though you're just knitting. Okay, so get to the end of the row wherever you are, and this is where we're going to introduce the purl stitch. So when you are knitting, as I mentioned, your yarn is usually back here. That's where it should be. Your yarn is in the back. And as we knit, we go into the stitch from left to right and into the stitch just like so, right? When we purl, we're actually going to have our yarn in front. So you want to move the yarn to the front, just like this. And we're going to go into the stitch from right to left to the front. So one way that I like to think about it, you guys, is if my yarn is in back and I'm knitting, let's just say I'm knitting, I'm taking my right hand needle and I'm going through the stitch to get to my yarn, right? So if my yarn is in front, I'm going to go through the stitch to get to my yarn. See how it's in front here, waiting for me? Does that make sense? Does that help in any way? That helps me out. Now you do want to make sure that your yarn is in front of your work. If you're going to start with a purl, put your yarn in front of your work before you take this right hand needle and put it into the stitch. Okay, so our yarn is in the front of our work and I'm ready to go. So I'm going to put my needle from right to left coming this direction. So you see my right hand needle is in front of my left hand needle and it's coming up here. Now this is a big thing, so everybody pay attention here, okay? A lot of beginners will take their yarn and they want to wrap the needle like this because it seems easy, right? It seems easier just to wrap it like that. But in order for your stitches to lay properly on the needle for the next row, you've got to take this yarn and wrap it that way. So if I'm looking at my needle here, my right hand needle, if it's pointing at 12 o'clock, I'm going to go counterclockwise. See, I'm going like here's 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 12, 11, 10, and I'm coming back. Make sense? If you're doing it the opposite, if you're going 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, blah, 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 that's not going to let your stitches lay properly and you're going to get twisted stitches. So make sure you're going counterclockwise around your right hand needle. Once you've wrapped that right hand needle, keep tension. And just like when we knit, when we went through this stitch to go get our yarn and then we brought our yarn back through that stitch, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to swing this needle back through that stitch. There's the new stitch right there, which means we can let this one fall off the left-hand needle. We're going to do it again. My yarn is still in front. I'm going to go from right to left into the stitch. I'm going to go counterclockwise around my right-hand needle, come out the stitch and off. In, around, out, 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 off. Okay. Now I haven't turned my work yet. One thing I want you to notice, you see all these bumps right there? Those are purl bumps, okay? The back side of a knit stitch is a purl stitch. So when I turn my work, I'm going to be looking at the knitted V's because on this side, I'm looking at the purls. So as I turn my work, meaning as I'm putting my needle into my right hand or my left hand, and I turn and I look at the stitches underneath my needle, see how those are those V's? They're those nice knitted V's. And you might be saying, well, why am I looking at V's? Because I just purled. Well, the back side of your purl, so when you purl, the back side of it creates these knits. So if we want the front of our fabric to all be these nice smooth V's, Whenever you see these V's, you're going to knit. Whenever you see these purl bumps, you're going to purl, all right, if we're working on stockinette. So on this side, we're going to knit across this entire row. So we know how to do that. So we're just going to go in and just knit this row. Remember, our yarn is in back. Our yarn is in back, and we're just going to knit. See that? So now I just finished knitting. See, I have all those nice V's right there. And when I turn my work, I'm going to see purl bumps. So I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to see purl bumps. So if you guys remember in Knitting 101, I talked a lot about being able to read your knitting. It's very important that you learn to understand what's on your needles and read your knitting, because it will help you when you get tired. So for this example, if we're working in stockinette stitch, that's what this is called. When you pick up your work and you place this in your left hand, you're getting ready to work and you're trying to remember if you're on a knit row or a purl row and you're working in stockinette, if you pick this up and you're looking at purl bumps, you're on a purl row. If you pick this up and you're looking at knit V's, you're on a knit row. So if I were to drop this down, pick this up, I can see here, okay, I'm working in stockinette stitch. I know that's where I am. I'm looking at purls. That means I'm going to purl. So I make sure my yarn is in front. I go from right to left. I'm going to hold the yarn in this hand now. I still go the long way around, right? I'm still going counterclockwise. If this is pointing at 12, I'm going 3, 2, 1, 12, 11, 10, 9, and back around. Geez Louise. That's what you guys are probably doing right now. I come out the stitch and off. In, around, out, 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 off. Now, as you're knitting and purling, you're going to find a way to hold the yarn that works for you best. Like, I don't hold my yarn like this when I normally purl, like ever, but I'm trying to show you guys a bunch of different ways so you can see what works best for you. If I am knitting or purling with my yarn over here, I knit better with my yarn over here than purl, because I actually hold my yarn in my left hand. It's the same motion. I just hold my yarn in a different hand. It's okay if your last stitches are a little bit loose. Remember, we know how to fix that with a little wiggle and a little tug. So in this first stitch, I know I'm going to knit because I'm looking at my knit side, right? I'm looking at my knit V's. So I'll go into the stitch, around my needle, come out and off. If I need to tighten up my stitch, wiggle my needle, tug my working yarn, and it tightens up the stitch and it makes it a little bit nicer. And I can continue on. A little wiggle and a little tug tightens up that first stitch. I'm just going to go ahead and knit down this row. I'll try and hold my yarn in my hand like this when I purl on the next one. And you'll see it looks funny for me because it's not my ideal way to purl, but maybe that'll help you because I'll go even slower. I'm at the end of the row. You guys are probably looking at that. You're like, oh, that looks familiar. That looks like a sweater fabric, right? It looks like that's what's called stockinette. So if I turn my work, if I'm holding my yarn the same way, I just make sure it's in front of my needles, and I will go in, go around, out and off, in, around, out and off, in, around, out and off. We're going to keep doing this here for a little bit longer, and then we're going to have a small bio break, and we're going to transition from doing full rows of knits and purls to combining knits and purls within the same row. Because once you know these two stitches, it's all about the combination of the two stitches that gives you the different looks that you get to create. So I finished my purl row. I have this sea of purls. I turn my work and I can see my nice knit row right there. So I want you guys to keep doing this, keep working on a knit row and then a purl row and then a knit row and a purl row. One thing I want you to notice is if you have stitches that look twisted down here at the bottom, like where the V is, see how this V, see how the two legs of the V are separated? They're not twisted. If your stitches are twisted, you are not wrapping your needle correctly when you purl. So I want you to really pay attention to that. Okay. All right. Okay. So keep doing this. We're going to do a small bio break. And when I do this, I'm actually going to do a screen share here. And here we are, Jenny.
Thank you, Marley. Okay, so one more time, I just wanted to share with you guys this wonderful offer from our friends at I Like Knitting. Regularly, this magazine is $47.64 for an entire year subscription. But for you guys, we have a special introductory offer for you today. It's 75% off that $47.64 price. So just $11.88, you get access to an entire year, plus all of the back issues. It does publish 6 times a year. And it's been in business or, publishing for at least a couple of years now. So you'll have hundreds and hundreds of wonderful patterns at your disposal to practice your wonderful skills that you're learning today. So again, just $11.88 to claim the introductory deal. The link here is at the bottom of the screen. We'll also put it in the chat again for you guys as well. If you have any questions about I Like Knitting magazine, feel free to post them in the chat, post them in the Q&A. We'll get back to you. We also have a crochet magazine as well. It's called I Like Crochet. And so if you're already a member of I Like Crochet, this is, a similar magazine, but for knitting. So it's a great opportunity for you guys all to practice your great skills. I think that is all. I think, Marley, if you're still there, you can probably go to the next slide real quick while we're doing our bio break. Okay, so we also have advanced knitting classes coming up later this month with Marley. On March 16th, we are hosting a class called Fixing Common Mistakes in Knitting. So Marley will just kind of be going over some of her favorite tips and tricks to make your knitting even better. And then on March 23rd, we're hosting a class on stranded knitting. And then on March 30th, we have a brioche knitting 2.0 class. Last month we did brioche knitting, intro to brioche knitting. It was really popular. So we're going to do a continuation of that class. Individually, each class is $19.99, but you can buy all 3 classes for $29.99, which is a 50% savings. It's a really, really great opportunity for you guys to take your knitting skills to the next level. If Marley is a wonderful teacher, and even if if you've never done stranded knitting, it's an advanced technique, but you got to start somewhere. And just again, for me, just being in any class with Marley, like whether or not I'm really absorbing what she's teaching, it's just you always pick up a few hidden gems here and there. So Marley is a great teacher, and she'll be leading us in all 3 of these classes. So you can sign up here at the bottom, Fave Crafts. We also just posted it in the chat. So favecrafts.eventbrite.com is where you can sign up for those classes. You can sign up for each one individually, or you can buy the bundle option for just $30. And these classes are 2 hours long. All of them are recorded, so you get to keep the recording of these classes forever as well. So if you can't make one of the dates, but still want to attend, you can still get the class and watch the recording later. So, all right.
Awesome. I feel like I should give you a tip or something for saying such kind things about me.
I mean, I'm not actually a knitter. I mean, I've tried a few times. I've made a few things, but I've sat in on so many classes now with Marley, and they're just wonderful. I'm amazed at everything she can do. So I always learn something new, even if I don't, go and do it after the class. So
that's awesome. It makes me blush. All right. So I thought I would show you guys how, because I mentioned it, how I hold the yarn in my left hand when I knit and purl. It's actually the exact same motion. As far as I'm doing the exact same thing in the stitches, I'm just holding my yarn over here. So I'm still going in the same way. I'm still wrapping my needle the same way and coming out the same way. It's just for whatever, like I use my my finger a little bit more to essentially like lay the yarn on top of the needle. I don't know why. It's not very ergonomically correct, I guess, but through the years of knitting, I guess my knitting has migrated to this way. This is called Continental. And then when I purl, I keep my yarn there the same way. But notice I'll bring my yarn to the front and then I just start purling. So for me, purling is really easy. I just I lay the yarn on top and I just hold it down to create some tension and then pop it out. So this is called Continental. Actually, a lot of crocheters who've never knit before will gravitate towards Continental because this is how a lot of right-handed crocheters hold their yarn with the yarn in their left hand. I am sorry, guys. They are barking. I have people here to fix my basement, so the dogs are
earlier
barking
before we got started, one of the comments in the chat, I think, was talk about your dogs. So I think they must have heard someone ask that.
That's great. You guys jinxed me. So there's somebody here to look at the. I'm having my basement finished, and so they're here to work on the basement. All right, so we're gonna try and ignore them. I'm sorry, you guys. This is what we're gonna do. So we're gonna hold our yarn in the back and we're going to knit 2 and then purl 2 and then knit 2 and then purl 2 and then knit 2. Okay. When we go between, I'm sorry, let me shut them up. I'm sorry, can you guys go?
Yeah, I had to move my dogs from this room into the other room as well. So just one of the joys now of working from home for everyone. We have our new coworkers that we have to deal with at home.
I'm so sorry, you guys.
Makes me miss my old coworkers that don't bark.
You know, the killer part is that my teenage children are home and they know I'm doing this and they are not helping.
Yes. I love them.
Sorry, you guys. Okay. So we're gonna go between a knit and a purl within the same row. So we're gonna knit the first 2 stitches. So let's do that. Let's knit the first 2 stitches. Oh, the joys of working from home. Okay, so we knit the first 2 stitches and now we want to purl these 2. Well, where does our yarn have to be when we purl? It has to be in front. But we don't want to bring our yarn to the front like over top of our needle because that creates a yarn over, right? That'll create an extra stitch. So what you do is you take your yarn and you wring it between the needles. Okay, can you guys see that? So my yarn is in back after I knit 2. So I bring my yarn between my needles to the front. And now my yarn is in front, ready for me to purl. So I'm going to go into the stitch and purl it. And come out the stitch and off. I'm going to purl the next one, go into the stitch and purl it. Come out the stitch and off. I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches. So that means I have to bring my yarn back to the back. So I go between my needles, back to the back. Knit 2 stitches. The biggest thing to remember as you're transitioning from a knit and a purl within the same row is to move your yarn between your needles to where you need it to be in order to complete a purl or a knit. And you do not want to just lay the yarn over top of your needle or you'll get an unintended yarn over. Between my needles to the back, and I'll knit 2. Okay, doesn't look like much yet, but what we will notice before we turn our work here, you see how we have 2 purl bumps right here and 2 purl bumps right there. So those are the purls that we did. So we have a knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit. So as we continue on and we continue to read our knitting, and we know that we're going to eventually stack our purls and stack our knits, you'll know what stitch you are on based on what the stitches are underneath your needle. So as I turn my work here and I look at my first 2 stitches, I'm looking at 2 purl bumps, right? So that's my clue. I'm going to purl these first 2 stitches, okay? So I make sure, I'm gonna grab my yarn, make sure my yarn is in front of my needle, go into the stitch and purl it. Go into the next stitch and purl it. Now these 2 stitches, I have to pull this down a little bit. You see how there are no bumps there. They are the knit V's. So that means I'm going to knit them. So I have to take my yarn between my needles back to the back and knit. Okay. I'm looking at 2 bumps, which means I'm going to purl, bring my yarn between my needles back to the front, and I purl them. Between my needles back to the back, because the next 2 stitches are knits, I'm going to knit them. Between the needles to the front, I'm going to purl the last 2. Now, we've done 2 rows. It's going to be easier to see our columns. Even on this side, we can see there's the start of 2 purls, there's 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls. When I turn my work, it's going to be even more obvious. I'm going to have my knits, purls, knits, purls, knits. Now, did you notice on this side, I only have 2 columns of purls. And when I turn my work to the other side, I have 3 columns of purls. Bonus points if you can tell me why. Anybody? Anybody? Come on, I know you know why.
No one is.
Nobody's saying anything. So remember, the back side of a knit is a purl and the back side of a purl is a knit. So on this side, these first 2 purls, as I'm looking at them over here, are knits on the opposite side. These first 2 knits over here are purls on that side.
I think Julie was our winner. She said
awesome.
Yeah.
Bonus points.
The knit is purl. Yeah.
You get bragging rights, Julie. So that's really what it is. So as you're working through this and you're starting to work, if for some reason you're like, why do I all of a sudden have a knit on my purl bumps here? Well, you accidentally did a purl on the opposite side. Does that make sense? So as you're creating ribbing, that's what we're creating here. If you ever put this down and pick it up, again, we're going to read our knitting. Always look. If you're looking at the first 2 stitches and you don't see bumps, or your first stitch and you don't see a bump, you're looking at knits. So you're going to knit them. So let's continue on doing this ribbing like this. This would be called 2x2 ribbing because you're doing 2 knits and then 2 purls. You have to remember to move the yarn between your needles as you transition from a knit to a purl. I'm going to show you why here. I'm going to purposely make a mistake, okay? Because somebody's going to make this mistake and I don't want you to get stuck. So I just finished purling here. Let's say I forgot to move my yarn between my needles. So I go into knit and I knit it. And what you can see right now is it looks like I have an extra strand of string right there, right? But let's say I don't even notice it yet. Let's say I don't notice and I continue on and I'm like, no big deal. So I go and I'm purling. And because half the time you won't notice it until the next row. And I'm going to finish with my last 2 knits. I'm going to turn my work, la-di-da. I'm like, yes, I'm getting this ribbing for this hat. Everything's looking fantastic. And I come over here, I'm like, oh, that looks so great. And so then I'm like, okay, well, what do I start here? Okay, so I have a purl there. That means I'm going to start with 2 purls. Great. I don't have to overthink this. It's been a long day at work. I don't have to tax my brain anymore. I just have to rely on my eyes. If I'm looking at purls, I purl them. If I'm looking at knits, I knit them. And remember to move my yarn between my needles. Perfect. This is awesome. Marley's the best. She's so right. It's so much easier to read my knitting. Oh, I'm going to be a master at this. I can't wait to cable. I can't wait to lace. And oh, what's that? There's not a bump. It doesn't look like a knit stitch. Like, what is that? Right? What happened to my knitting? Then you think to yourself, oh no, I dropped a stitch. There's a hole. I dropped a stitch. Oh no, where's my stitch? Did I drop a stitch? Okay, well, let's stop. You didn't drop a stitch. What it was is you didn't move your yarn from the back to the front or from the front to the back when you did this particular transition. So you have an unintended yarn over. So if you only have one of these, no big deal. You literally let it drop off your needle and just carry on, okay? The slack will kind of get worked into the other stitches and just ignore it. Okay, so if you find it, don't knit it, don't do anything else. just let it drop off your needle and it goes away. All right. Whew, that was a close one. Super easy to do. Okay. What would have, if it was a drop stitch, that would be a whole different matter, but that is something that I go over in my Fixing Common Mistakes. Like, guys, that's a really great class. If you only buy one of my classes, that's a great class to have, guys, because it will make you like such a fearless knitter. So now you're good. Everything looks great. We're starting to get some cool ribbing here. You're like, wow, that looks pretty fantastic. Look at all these stitches I've done. It's kind of fun, right? But let's say that you didn't want to do 2x2 ribbon anymore, okay? Or maybe you want to change it up. So let's change it up. Let's just decide that instead of putting on this particular row, we're going to switch it up to where instead of these knits, we're going to make those purls. We're going to make these knits. We're going to make these purls and make these knits and make these purls. So like we're switching up the pattern, okay? So this first row, we're doing the opposite of what's down here on this first row. And then we're going to go back to doing exactly what we're looking at. So on this one, if I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to purl it. I'm going to hold the yarn in my left hand this time. So I'm going to purl and I'll purl this one. And I'm going to knit these two. So I'm looking at purl. So I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm going to knit these two. I'm looking at knit. So I'm going to purl these two. And this is so I can change up the pattern, right? I'm looking at purl, so I'm going to knit these two. I'm looking at knit, so I'm going to purl these two. So if you accidentally mixed up a pattern, that's kind of what it's going to look like. You'd be like, what? But we're doing this on purpose, all right? So we're switching up the pattern, but now when we rotate around, we're going to do exactly what the stitches say. So if it's a knit, we're going to knit it. If it's a purl, we're going to purl it, so on and so forth. So I will go ahead and knit these two, purl these two, knit these two, purl these two, knit these two. Ta-da! And we've altered our pattern. So we're going to get like a basket weave. So I'm back here. Again, I'm going to do what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at purls. So I'm going to purl them. I'm looking at knits. So I'm going to knit them. Purls, I'm going to purl them. Knits, I'm going to knit them. So on and so forth. I'm going to do this for a couple rows. Let's get a basket weave here. Again, I'm holding the yarn in my left hand, but it's the exact same movement. I'm still purling the exact same way. I'm just holding it into my other hand. So I turn my work. Without counting and making sure everything's even, let's just say that those are about even. All right, so let's change it up again. So we're going to make this to where we're switching it up again. We're going to make these purls. We're going to change those to knits, change those to purls, change those to knits, change those to purls, and so on and so forth. Can you see how it's breaking up the pattern? You see that? So let's change it up. Yikes, can you show? I missed that question.
Which question? Oh, can you show me garter stitch?
Yeah. Can you show me garter stitch is just knitting every single row. If you knit every row. So again, on this one, I'm going to do opposite. I'm doing opposite what I'm looking at just to switch it up. And guys, the only reason I'm showing you this is just to show you that with just learning the knit and the purl, I mean, look at the variation of stitches you're getting now. And this is just a variation on a ribbing. Like this is nothing. This is great. So now as I've turned, I'm going to knit my knits and purl my purls. So the selvage stitch, if you're talking about your outside stitches, one thing, so let me talk about this. come across some knitters who say you should always add an extra stitch so that way you can slip it on either side of your work, okay, to make it easier for seaming. I'm going to tell you that, one, I don't ever do that because I always forget to slip the stitch and it just becomes tedious to me. And two, if you're coming across a pattern that tells you a number of stitches to have on your needle, I would not alter that number of stitches to change it up for something that you think it should be done. Because there's a reason the designer did not put a selvage stitch or something on there. Now, if you're talking about the first stitch of your row, that's a little wiggle and a little tug. So I'm going to show you here. So I've turned my work and you can see the basket weave really taking shape there. You guys see that? Okay. I'm going to go back to stockinette stitch so that we can get some stockinette, and then we're going to do 1 by 1 ribbing. So I'll tighten up this first stitch. Let's see, I'll hold it over here. Okay. So in this first stitch, when you knit it or purl it, once you pop it off and you have that stitch on your right hand needle, if you tug your yarn, see how it tightens that up? It tightens up that stitch. And if you wiggle your needle, tug the yarn, it tightens up the stitch below. So you want to be careful you don't tighten up that stitch below too much, otherwise it'll start to kink up your work. But that's one way you can really make sure that your edges are a little bit more, more uniform. It's just, I call it a little wiggle and a little tug. So you wiggle your needle and you tug your yarn. It tightens the stitch below the stitch you just created. And over time, all of those edge stitches just look really nice. So again, I'm just going to go back to stockinette stitch here. So nothing new. I just knit all of those stitches and now I'm going to purl all these stitches. Make sure my yarn is in front of my needle. I'm just going to get a couple of rows of stockinette here so that way we can go into 1 by 1 ribbing. And if we just did 2 by 2 ribbing, which was 2 knits and then 2 purls, what do you think 1 by 1 ribbing is? Let's see if anybody gives the bonus points.
People were prepared for pop quizzes today, Marla.
I know.
Always keeping us on our toes. Honey Lynn is guessing garter.
Nope. Garter is where you knit every single row. Yep. Knit purl. Yep. 1 knit, 1 purl. 1 knit, 1 purl. That's exactly right. So 1 by 1 ribbing is 1 knit stitch, 1 purl stitch, or vice versa. And 2 by 2 is 1 or 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches, or vice versa. 3 by 2 could be 3 knits, 2 purls, or vice versa. So yeah, that's how that goes. Stockinette stitch, what we're doing here, that's where we're talking about an entire row is either knit or an entire row is purled. When we talk about the different stitches changing within the row, that's how we can change up a stitch pattern, because now all of a sudden you're getting knits and purls. So you're creating bumps if you put a purl on a smooth side of the fabric, so you can create some cool texture to a stitch pattern. As you can probably tell, like I'm much better holding the yarn in my left hand than my right, but I can do it. All right, so I got some stockinette stitch here. You can see I got a little bit. So I have garter stitch down here, which is just knitting every row. Here's stockinette, where I did a row of knits, a row of purl, a row of knit, row of purl. This is where we jumped into 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 knit. And then I changed it up. So I changed the pattern. So I was stacking my knits and stacking my purls. Then I did 1 row where I changed the pattern, and then I continued to stack my knits, stack my purls based on that 1 row. Then I changed it up again, so that way I got basket weave. You see what I mean? You guys know how to do this. I went back to stockinette, and now I'm going to have you guys do knit 1, purl 1. Do I ever purl Continental? I always purl Continental. So I'll show you how I purl Continental. And I'll show you guys why I like it, because it's so much easier to move my yarn between my needles, okay? So if I'm going to do 1 by 1 ribbing, I'm going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, okay? So I'm going to knit 1 stitch, bring my yarn between my needles, purl 1 stitch, between my needles, knit 1 stitch, between my needles, purl 1 stitch, between my needles, knit 1, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. Turn my work. And again, I'm going to knit my knits and purl my purls. So if I'm looking at a knit stitch, I knit it. If I'm looking at a purl stitch, I purl it. If I'm looking at a knit, I knit it. If I'm looking at a purl, I purl it. See how quickly I can just move my yarn between my needles? That's why Continental knitters don't usually mind doing any sort of ribbing, but throwers or English style, they think it's tedious to move the yarn back and forth between the needles. They don't really like ribbing. I love it.
Bernice is wondering, is knit one, purl one also known as moss stitch?
No, because moss stitch is where, well, there's seed stitch and moss stitch, but they're both loosely based on the same thing. For this knit one, purl one, we are stacking our knits and stacking our purls. If we wanted to do seed stitch, every time I reversed my work, and if I would do the opposite of what I'm looking at, that would be seed stitch. Moss stitch is where you would do 2 rows. So it'd be like 2 V's, and then I would do 2 purls, and then I would do 2 V's and then 2 purls, or 2 knits and then 2 purls. Where this, I'm doing ribbing. So I'm stacking my knits and stacking my purls. You'll see, I'm going to do seed stitch here in just a minute. So, because I want you to have that fabric.
And Jan is wondering what happens if the edges begin to roll.
That's what they naturally do. That's actually something we're going to talk about.
Perfect.
We're going to talk about the fabrics we're creating. Don't worry about it right yet. Okay. So I've been going back and forth, and I'm stacking my knits and I'm stacking my purls. But what if, so that creates, not what if. As I stack my knits and stack my purls, whether it's 1 by 1, 2 by 2, 2 by 1, 3 by 2, whatever it is, you're creating a rib type texture. If you want to alternate this, instead of stacking my knits and stacking my purls, I'm going to alternate every row, meaning, so I just did some ribbing here. You guys see how it's stretchy there? I'm going to switch it up now and do seed stitch. And seed stitch is where if I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to purl it. If I'm looking at a purl, I'm going to knit it. Okay. So it's the opposite of what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to purl it. I'm looking at a purl, I'm going to knit it. I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to purl it. I'm looking at a purl, I'm going to knit it. So I'm doing the opposite of what the stitch is. I'm going to go all the way down. When I turn my work, I'm going to do the opposite of what the stitch is again. I never want to do the same thing of what I'm looking at. So if I'm looking at a purl, I'm going to knit. If I'm looking at a knit, I'm going to purl. And this is going to create seed stitch. And seed stitch is naturally wider in gauge than stockinette stitch, and especially wider in gauge to ribbing. Ribbing tends to pull in. That's the whole reason of it, right? It pulls in on the fabric. But when you do stockinette stitch, again, I'm going to do the opposite. So make sure you're doing the opposite of what you're looking at. So when you do seed stitch, it tends to be a little bit wider. Ribbing pulls in on itself. Stockinette stitch curls on itself. It curls to the purl side. And if you're going to do something with stockinette stitch, like a scarf or something, you've got to have a border to it. You've got to have like a seed stitch border, a garter stitch border, a ribbed border. It's got to be something that doesn't naturally curl on itself. Stockinette stitch naturally curls on itself, always, 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 even if you block it. I'm going to just get some more seed stitch here so you can see it. So it's one of those things that every new knitter I know, they're like, oh, I love the way stockinette stitch looks. I'm going to make a stockinette stitch scarf. And then they finish it and it rolls up like a Tootsie Roll. And they're like, how do I fix this? Well, the only way to fix it is to add a border. Hold on, what does that mean? Show the yarn before you purl between the knit and purl. So in my right or left hand, I'm not sure. So the question is, show the yarn. So here I am. So I'm looking at a purl bump. So I'm going to knit it. I'm looking at a knit stitch, so I'm going to purl it. So bring the yarn forward and I purl. Bring the yarn back and I knit. Bring the yarn forward and I purl. Bring the yarn back and I knit. Forward and I purl. All right, so as I turn my work here, you can now see there's seed stitch. You see the seed stitch? All right, so I'm gonna just scroll this down. You can see here the seed stitch is already wider than this little bit of stock or ribbing that we did, the 1x1 ribbing, and then you can see the stockinette here is a little bit wider than the ribbing, which we know, but it's still not as wide as the seed stitch. Seed stitch is wide. Then we have the basket weave, where we took a ribbing fabric, but we broke it up into sections to get a basket weave look. So see how this ribbing really pulls in, but when we change up the basket weave, it doesn't pull in so much anymore, right? It's just a pretty normal size fabric. So that's how you can take a ribbing style, break it up and create something that doesn't pull in and is like elastic. Then you're down here. Seed stitch and moss stitch are not the same thing. Seed stitch and moss stitch are different. Down here, you can see this is my stockinette stitch, and it is rolling on itself. Like you can see the back side. See how it starts to roll in? It always rolls in to the purl side. And that's 100% natural. That's what happens with stockinette stitch. So if you were to create something with stockinette stitch, you'd have to create either garter stitch on the bottom and the top and the sides, ribbing. You could do this, any sort of a relief stitch to hold the fabric on the side so it doesn't roll. But that rolling is 100% normal and natural. And then down here we have garter stitch. Okay, so this is seed stitch. Moss stitch is, it's like double it up. So it would be like, so right here we have, it's a purl and then a knit and a purl and a knit and a purl. Moss stitch is, it would be purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit. And then there's double moss stitch, which is essentially 2 by 2, and it's like 2 knits, 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 knits, 2 purls, 2 purls. There's subtle changes. The best thing to do if you guys are interested in learning different stitches like that is get a stitch dictionary or look up different stitch patterns on all free knitting. The last thing I want to show you here, because we're running out for time, guys, I want to show you a different bind off. So a normal bind off that you would do is just knit 2 stitches, have the back jump over the front. But now that you know how to knit and purl, there's something called binding off in pattern. And all that means is whatever that stitch pattern is that you're following, you would continue working that pattern, and then have the back stitch jump the front stitch. So for example, this one, we have seed stitch happening here. So I'm going to continue my seed stitch pattern and bind off. So this would be called binding off in pattern. So you would follow whatever your pattern is and bind off. So this stitch here is supposed to be a purl. So I will purl it. And then I'm supposed to knit this one. So I will knit it. And then I have that back stitch, jump over and off the front. This next stitch is supposed to be a purl. So I will purl it. I always bring my yarn back to the back, and then I have the back stitch jump up and over the front. This stitch should be a knit, back stitch, jump up and over the front. This stitch should be a purl, back, jump up and over the front. This should be a knit. Again, this is called binding off in pattern, and it works with any stitch pattern you're working on, especially like a ribbing stitch pattern. You would maintain your ribbing pattern and you would bind off in pattern. Sure. Somebody is asking if I could do Continental Knit and purl, so I will do that one more time. My next stitch here is a knit, so I will knit it. Back stitch jumps up and over the front. Run yarn forward because I'm supposed to purl this one. So that's how I purl. I always bring my yarn back to the back. Back stitch jumps up and over the front. And I'm supposed to knit. back stitch jumps over the front. Cut your yarn. Da, 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 da. Okay, here's the funny thing, y'all. I said add a pom-pom to your scissors. You'll never lose them.
And you lost your scissors, didn't you?
I lost my scissors. They're not here. They're like not here.
Oh my gosh.
You know what? So I'm going to grab, I have another set here. I think I took them with me to Colorado last weekend so that I didn't lose them. And then you just pull this up, give it a tug, tuck in your ends. Now this bind off isn't like any extra stretchy or anything. It's just that it bound everything off in pattern. So it's not just this row of knits, but that's called binding off in pattern. And now that you know knits and purls, it's important you know that. But this is your own little like texture swatch. If you have somebody in your family that is very like, they have to touch everything, like it's a sensory thing, this is a fun thing because there's a lot of texture here for them to feel. So they could put it in their pocket, especially the seed stitch. There you go, you guys.
Thank you. That was awesome. We do have we have a couple questions we didn't get to, but there are two that I want to ask real quick.
Sure.
Since I know you do continental knitting, someone's asking how easy or difficult is it to adapt to continental style knitting?
Honestly, I think it's just all about practice. Like, so you see me working with my English. It was not easy for me to go from continental to English, but it's all about it's just practice. Just watch somebody, like you can watch my videos on YouTube or, you know, even the videos I did here where I will hold it in my left hand and just trying to mimic. And it's just practice, just like anything else.
Yeah.
Yep.
Then Pearlie is wondering if a total beginner wanted to knit a blanket, what stitch would be the best?
Garter stitch.
All right. Perfect. We had a couple other questions, but they're pretty specific. I'm going to try to follow up with you guys via email. Actually, real quick, Lori, Honey and Lori is wondering, would love it if my circular needles didn't remain so inflexible even after a few years of use. So do you have any tips on how to?
So Honey Ann, if you're buying needles at like Joann's or Michael's or a Hobby Lobby or something, usually those needles have a very stiff plastic to them. One thing you could do is put them in boiling hot water, not the needle part, but the cord to make it a little more pliable and straighten it out for you. Or better yet, just invest in some higher end needles. These are Chiagoo, Chiagoo. This is the interchangeable set with their red lace cables. I love these. They are fantastic. I also, if you want to get more really higher end, the signature needles are really good. Jimmy Bean's Wool has some really nice needles. And then there's also like Knitter's Pride and Knit Picks needles, but I will be honest, I've seen those break quite often with the cord. These are my go-to workhorse, or the Addy needles. The more higher end needles, and it just makes your whole knitting experience even more enjoyable, you guys. It just makes it really nice. But yeah, if you don't have the money to buy new needles, I totally understand that. Soak your cord in hot water and then pull them out and straighten them out just like this and let them hang, and then that will straighten your cord for you, at least so that it's not all kinked up. But that helps a ton.
Awesome. Great tips.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us today. Marley, if you want to do a quick screen share real quick on that very last slide.
All right.
We go a couple minutes over to get some questions answered. So thank you for sticking with us, everyone. Let's just go to that last slide. So one more time, here is that deal for I Like Knitting, a great digital magazine full of wonderful tech edited patterns. If you're just beginning knitting, it's really important to have quality patterns. You hate to get halfway through a pattern and realize that the pattern is poorly written. So having tech edited patterns means that you're guaranteed a pattern that is going to work out. So if you're going to invest the time in making something, you want it to turn out right. So I Like Knitting is a great resource for that. If you have any questions, again, here's my contact information. My name is Jenny Bowden. Thank you, Marley, for leading the show today and teaching us all wonderful knitting tips, how to take our knitting skills to the next level. So if you guys do want to take those advanced classes, I will include a link tomorrow. I'm going to send out today's class recording. I will also include one more time the link to the first Learn to Knit class. And then I'll also include a link for the I Like Knitting deal, plus a link to sign up for the advanced classes. So stay tuned for the email to come tomorrow. If you guys don't get it, it should come directly from Zoom. But if you don't get it for whatever reason, feel free to reach out to me directly at jbowden@primecp.com.
Perfect. I do highly recommend that Fixing Mistakes class, y'all. If you don't take any of the others, take that one. Like that will liberate you with so much stuff, guys. Just take it. Just trust me on that. Just take it. It's so good.
And if you can't make that specific date and time, we do record every single class. So you will get a copy of the recording in your email. It is nice to join live in case you have questions. You can catch Marley in real time. But if you cannot join us live, then we're recording today. We'll record all 3 of the advanced classes. So we'll send it out to you.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks everybody. I gotta go coach some athletes.
Thank you, Marley. And thank you all for joining us today. It was great.
Bye guys.